Stay with me.
Check every unit!
Come on, please.
Zuri knew the cardinal rule of surviving the low-rent edge of the district. When the dark brings violent noises, you double the deadbolt, douse the lights, and pretend to be a ghost. Instead, sheer instinct overruled common sense the moment she found a dying stranger collapsed across her threshold, his life spilling onto the cold linoleum while heavy combat boots thudded in the stairwell below. If you want to see how an exhausted veterinary nurse accidentally dragged the city's deadliest underworld kingpin into her living room, hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and tell us where you're listening from. Torrential rain hammered the high-rise window, blurring the neon glow of the skyline into smeared streaks of amber and steel. It was barely past 4 in the morning. Zuri had just dragged herself home from a brutal 12-hour shift at the emergency vet hospital, her knuckles aching and her oversized cream sweater offering little defense against the deep, bone-weary chill. She had expected nothing more than the warmth of her cast-iron wood stove and 5 hours of undisturbed silence. Instead, her modest apartment smelled of copper, antiseptic, and imminent danger. Sprawled across her worn sofa lay a man who looked like an apex predator carved from violence and shadows. His damp, jet-black hair fell across bruised cheekbones, and his parted shirt exposed a chiseled torso canvas-inked with fierce, sprawling dragons. Below those tattoos, a thick strip of veterinary-grade gauze was already blooming crimson with fresh blood. With trembling fingers, Zuri pulled a heavy wool blanket over his frame, her gaze darting between his shallow breathing and the makeshift triage station on her coffee table. Glass dropper bottles, torn packaging, and a steaming mug of tea gone cold. She knew how to suture torn flesh, stabilize trauma, and stop hemorrhaging on panicked animals twice his weight. But as the man let out a low, guttural groan, his jaw clenching against the agony, Zuri realized this was no ordinary stray. In saving his life, she hadn't just broken her own survival rules. She had invited the most lethal war in the city right through her front door. The rusted elevator had sputtered to a halt between floors 3 weeks ago, forcing Zuri to haul her leaden legs up 6 flights of concrete stairs. Her uniform smelled faintly of surgical scrub, bleach, and wet fur. The emergency clinic had been an unrelenting meat grinder tonight. 3 emergency cesareans, a shattered femur from a hit and run, and a frantic Rottweiler that had nearly taken her forearm off before the sedative kicked in. All she wanted was hot tea, dry socks, and the kind of deep sleep that erased reality. She rounded the final landing on the 6th floor, her key already wedged between trembling, rain-slicked fingers. Then she saw a shadow. A massive, crumpled silhouette was wedged against her doorframe, blocking the threshold. In the flickering amber hum of the overhead fluorescent tube, the dark pool beneath him didn't look like rainwater. It was too thick, too black. "Hey," Zuri whispered, freezing mid-step as Instant screamed at her to retreat down the stairs. "Hey, you can't sleep here." No answer, only a ragged, wet breath rattling in the man's throat. Zuri stepped closer, the clinician in her overriding the sharp spike of terror in her chest. She knelt down on the wet floorboards. The stranger was broad-shouldered, clad in a ruined silk shirt soaked in dark arterial red. Rain-drenched black hair fell over a sculpted jaw, bruised a vicious shade of plum. His hand, wrapped around the deep gash tearing through his abdomen, was heavy and calloused, knuckles split from recent brutal impacts. Before she could check for a carotid pulse, a sharp metallic clack echoed from the bottom of the stairwell. Heavy combat boots struck the concrete steps below, 2 flights down, then another. "Check every unit on the upper floor," a harsh, low voice barked, the sound slicing through the storm's drone. "He's bleeding out. He couldn't have made it to the roof." "If he's behind a door, kick it off the hinges," a second voice answered, followed by the crisp, unmistakable racking of a firearm. Panic flared cold in Zuri's veins. If these men found him on her welcome mat, they wouldn't leave a witness behind to describe their faces. She had seconds. "Come on," she hissed under her breath, wedging her shoulder under the stranger's arm. He groaned, a low, terrifying sound that reverberated against her ribs, but his eyes remained rolled back, lost to shock and blood loss. He was pure dead weight, easily twice her size. Gritting her teeth, Zuri dug her sneakers into the linoleum, unlocked her deadbolt with one hand, and dragged him backward across the threshold. His boots dragged through the pool of red just as the fifth-floor fire door banged open beneath them. With a final, agonizing heave, Zuri pulled him inside, shoved the heavy wooden door shut, and turned the deadbolt with a soft, breathless click. Zuri leaned her entire weight against the heavy wooden door, holding her breath until her lungs burned. Outside in the dim hallway, the heavy footsteps paused directly in front of her unit. A shadow blocked the sliver of light beneath the frame. The brass handle rattled once, hard and deliberate, before a muffled curse drifted through the wood. "Clear. Check the fire escape." The boots pounded away, fading toward the roof access. Exhaling a shaky breath, Zuri turned to the bleeding giant collapsed across her entryway. She couldn't leave him there. Straining every muscle, she half-dragged, half-maneuvered him across the worn rug to the sofa, letting his dead weight sink into the cushions. Years of treating mangled street dogs and trauma cases kicked in, overriding the icy fear clawing at her throat. She dashed to the bathroom and returned with her emergency kit, curved suture needles, braided silk thread, iodine, and a bottle of veterinary-grade antiseptic. Kneeling beside him, Zuri sliced away his ruined shirt with trauma shears. The sight made her breath hitch. Sprawling across his chiseled chest and shoulders were intricate, predatory dragons, inked in dark, coiled detail. But beneath the art, a jagged blade wound tore across his lower abdomen, spilling dark arterial blood over his defined stomach. She soaked a clean towel in antiseptic and pressed it hard against the gash. A sudden, vice-like grip clamped around her wrist. Zuri gasped. The stranger's eyes had cracked open, dark, glassy with fever, but sharp as shattered flint. Even drowning in shock, the aura rolling off him was suffocating. "No hospitals," he rasped, his voice a low, gravelly command that scraped against the silence of the room. His grip tightened, bruising her skin. "No police." "You're losing too much blood," Zuri whispered, meeting his lethal gaze without flinching. "I'm a vet tech, not a surgeon. If I do this, it's going to hurt like hell, and you have to stay quiet." A faint, humorless smirk twitched at the corner of his blood-streaked lips. "Then sew me up, little doctor, and don't make a sound." His fingers went slack as he drifted under again. Working swiftly under the amber glow of her floor lamp, Zuri flushed the deep laceration with saline. Every time the curved needle pierced his flesh, the man's jaw clenched so hard the muscles jumped, a low rumble vibrating in his chest, but he never cried out. She tied off each stitch with practiced clinical precision, closing the torn tissue layer by layer until the bleeding slowed to a dull seep. She wrapped his midsection in tight, sterile gauze, secured the dressing, and pulled a heavy wool blanket up to his chest. Exhausted, her hands trembling as the adrenaline ebbed away, Zuri collapsed into the armchair across from him, watching the rise and fall of the stranger's chest as the storm raged on outside. Pale morning light bled through the rain-streaked window, replacing the storm's violent shadows with a dull, cold gray. Zuri startled awake, her neck stiff and aching from sleeping upright in the armchair. The apartment was suffocatingly quiet, save for the hum of the old refrigerator and the faint hiss of dying embers in the cast-iron stove. She snapped her gaze toward the sofa. It was empty. The wool blanket was neatly folded at the edge of the cushions, and the blood-soaked towels were gone. There was no smear of red on the floorboards, no sound of labored breathing. It was as if the night's nightmare had been nothing more than an exhaustion-fueled hallucination. Zuri stood on trembling legs, moving toward the coffee table. Sitting dead center on the worn wood was a thick stack of crisp, unbanded $100 bills, easily $10,000. Resting on top of the cash was a heavy silver flip lighter, its polished surface catching the morning glare. Intricately carved dragons wrapped around its casing, mirroring the ink that had covered the stranger's chest. She picked up the cool metal. On the reverse side, deeply engraved into the silver, was a single 10-digit phone number. No name, no explanation. Her heart pounded against her ribs as she reached for the remote and clicked on the small television resting on the counter. The morning news broadcasts flared to life, the anchor's voice solemn and urgent. Breaking news out of the downtown financial district, where a violent clash erupted in the early morning hours outside the Crown Tower. Authorities are currently searching for this man, 32-year-old Joe Young, the enigmatic figurehead of the city's largest syndicated crime network. A crystal-clear photograph filled the screen. The breath trapped in Zuri's throat. It was him. The razor-sharp jawline, the piercing dark eyes that had looked right through her soul, and the imposing presence that even a low-resolution mugshot couldn't diminish. The screen cut to live footage of yellow police tape fluttering around bullet-riddled luxury vehicles and pools of rain-washed blood. Joe Young is considered armed, extremely dangerous, and is believed to have sustained severe injuries during the ambush, the anchor continued. Police urge citizens not to approach, as rival factions are suspected to be actively sweeping the city. The silver lighter felt like a live grenade in Zuri's palm. She hadn't just patched up a common criminal or a back-alley brawler. She had pulled the city's most feared Shadow King back from the edge of the grave. And now she was holding the only link between him and the crosshairs of a full-scale gang war. A sharp, heavy knock thudded against the door, rattling the deadbolt in its frame. Zuri froze, the silver lighter still cold against her palm. Shoving the stack of cash in the lighter beneath the worn sofa cushion, she wiped her damp hands on her sweater and drew a slow, steady breath. She opened the door just a crack, keeping the security chain locked. Standing on the landing was a man in a rumpled charcoal trench coat. He was broad-shouldered with slicked-back gray hair and bloodshot eyes that carried the cynical exhaustion of a seasoned cop. He held up a gold shield, though his grip was casual, almost dismissive. "Detective Hayes, Organized Crime Division," he said, not waiting for an invitation as he leaned his shoulder against the doorframe. "Just doing a routine canvass of the upper floors. You mind opening up, miss?" Zuri unlatched the chain and pulled the door open, keeping her posture guarded. "Is something wrong, officer?" Hayes didn't answer immediately. His beady eyes swept across the modest living room, lingering on the tidy sofa, the open kitchen, and the damp linoleum floor. He took a slow, deliberate sniff, his brow furrowing. "Smells like an industrial hazmat unit in here. Heavy on the pine sol and bleach. A little early for deep spring cleaning, isn't it?" "I work overnight shifts at the downtown emergency veterinary clinic. Between ringworm cases, parvo, and open fractures, bleach is the only thing that keeps my scrubs from contaminating my home." "Right, the vet clinic." Hayes walked slowly toward the small coffee table, his heavy shoes creaking against the floor. He tapped the wood with a single leather-gloved finger. "Funny thing about last night, a high-value individual went missing a few blocks from here, left a lot of blood behind, the kind of blood that usually requires a quiet place and some very discreet stitching to survive." He turned back to face her, his gaze sharp and calculating. You wouldn't happen to have heard any commotion on your floor around 4 this morning, would you? Heavy footsteps, maybe someone looking for medical help? The storm was rattling the windows all night. I came home, took a shower, and fell asleep in that armchair. I didn't hear a thing. Hayes stared at her for a long, suffocating moment, a cold, knowing smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. He pulled a business card from his pocket and tossed it onto the table. "Keep your eyes open, Doc," Hayes said, his voice dropping into a low, veiled threat. "The people looking for him aren't as polite as I am. If you remember anything, call me first." Zuri spent the rest of the day in a state of quiet dread, the detective's parting words echoing in her mind. By twilight, the damp city air had grown bitter, wrapping the narrow streets in a dense fog. Needing to escape the suffocating walls of her apartment and prepare for another graveyard shift, she bundled into her dark coat and slipped out through the rear exit into the service alley. The alley was narrow, flanked by brick walls slick with condensation and overflowing commercial dumpsters. She had only taken 5 steps when a dark figure detached itself seamlessly from the shadows behind an industrial fire escape. Before Zuri could scream, a gloved hand covered her mouth and she was pulled firmly into the recessed alcove of a locked steel doorway. "Make a sound and you won't live to see your clinic tonight," a smooth, razor-cold voice murmured near her ear. Zuri forced herself to stay still, her heart hammering violently. The man slowly lowered his hand, stepping back just enough for her to turn. He was young, sharp-featured, and impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit that hid the lethal posture of a trained killer. A thin silver scar traced from his right temple down to his jawline. His eyes, dark and unblinking, assessed her like a sniper gauging a target. "Who are you?" Zuri breathed, her voice trembling despite her best efforts. "My name is Tay. I work for the man whose life you stitched together last night. The boss told me to keep an eye on your building. It's a good thing I did. Hayes wasn't doing routine police work. He's on the payroll of the Red Dragon Triad." The blood drained from Zuri's face. "The police?" "There are no police in this war, little nurse," Tay interrupted, his gaze flicking toward the alley entrance to ensure they weren't followed. "Only sides. The Triad knows Joe Young escaped the ambush alive. They know a civilian with medical skills had to have patched him up, and Hayes just confirms their suspicions. They have your name, they have your shift schedule." Zuri backed against the cold brick wall. "I don't know anything about your syndicate. I just stopped him from bleeding to death on my floor. To them, that makes you an asset, or leverage," Tay said flatly, pulling a burner phone from his coat and thrusting it into her hands. "The boss owes you a blood debt, which is the only reason you're breathing right now. But you are now a pawn on the board. Do not go home after work. If you see anything unusual tonight, use the number on that silver lighter, or you won't survive till sunrise." Before Zuri could speak, Tay stepped back into the swirling mist, vanishing as swiftly and silently as a phantom. The hum of fluorescent lights and the rhythmic whir of the clinic's oxygen concentrators did nothing to calm the knot tightening in Zuri's stomach. It was 2 a.m. The animal hospital was empty of other staff. The supervising vet had been called out to an emergency equine colic an hour ago, leaving Zuri alone to monitor the post-op recovery ward. Every shadow through the frosted glass doors looked like a predator. Suddenly, the clinic's automatic chimes sounded from the reception lobby, followed immediately by the harsh shatter of the front plate glass. Zuri bolted from the treatment bay, heart hammering against her ribs. Standing in the darkened waiting area was a mountain of a man in a black leather jacket. A jagged scar cut across his shaven head, and his eyes burned with ruthless intent. Park, the Triad's most notorious enforcer. Behind him, 2 armed henchmen stood guard at the shattered entrance. "Zuri, right?" Park asked, his voice a gravelly, guttural rumble, as he drew a serrated combat knife from his belt. "Slicing into Joe Young's business was your last mistake. Tell me where he's hiding, and I might make your death quick." Panic flared white-hot, but Zuri's hands didn't freeze. Backing slowly into the preparation room, she reached behind her back, her fingers wrapping around the thick plastic barrel of a high-dose veterinary tranquilizer, a concentrated mixture of ketamine and xylazine meant to subdue an enraged 500-pound mastiff. "I don't know where he is," Zuri said, keeping her voice level as Park stepped over the threshold into the sterile lights of the back room. "Wrong answer," Park snarled, lunging forward with terrifying speed, blades slashing through the air. Zuri dodged sideways, catching the heavy stainless steel surgical tray and slamming it directly into Park's face. Instruments clattered violently to the floor. The blow barely staggered him, but it bought her half a second. As Park roared and grabbed her collar, slamming her against the steel examination table, Zuri jammed the unshielded, heavy-gauged needle straight through his leather jacket and deep into the side of his neck, thumbing the plunger all the way down. Park gasped, his pupils blowing wide. The sheer potency of the neurosedative hit his central nervous system like a freight train. His grip faltered, his legs turning to rubber, as a confused, slurry curse escaped his lips before his massive body crashed heavily against the linoleum. "Park!" one of the men in the lobby shouted, footsteps sprinting down the corridor. Zuri sprinted blindly down the hall, darting into the fortified narcotics and surgical supply closet. She slammed the heavy steel-reinforced door shut, turned the deadbolt, and threw down the internal sliding bar just as heavy shoulders slammed against the outside panels. Trapped in the pitch darkness with bullets beginning to splinter the heavy frame, Zuri pulled the burner phone and the heavy silver lighter from her pocket, her trembling fingers dialing the engraved number. The heavy steel door groaned under the relentless assault from outside. Gunfire shredded the outer drywall in deafening bursts, sending plumes of plaster and sharp wood splinters flying into the cramped closet. Zuri slid to the floor, clutching the burner phone to her ear as the line rang once, twice. A click cut the ringing short. "Speak," a voice commanded, deep, gravelly, and instantly recognizable. "They're inside the clinic," Zuri gasped, her voice trembling as another gunshot struck the metal plate inches from her head. "Park's men, they found me." A chilling silence fell over the line for a single second, followed by the crisp sound of a slide racking back on a firearm. "Stay low, keep behind the steel," Joe Young said, his tone devoid of panic, vibrating with lethal certainty. "I am 2 minutes out." Outside, the heavy impacts against the doors suddenly ceased. "Bring the breaching torch from the van," a henchman shouted through the hallway. "Cut the hinges off." Zuri pulled her knees to her chest, counting the agonizing seconds in the dark. The smell of burning metal began to seep under the crack of the door. Then, the night exploded. The roar of multiple high-powered engines shattered the clinic's front facade, followed by the deafening percussion of flashbang grenades. Rapid, suppressed gunfire tore through the clinic corridors with surgical precision, short, controlled double taps echoing over agonizing screams. Within 30 seconds, the heavy, frantic gun battle collapsed into dead silence. The heavy sliding bar on the other side of the closet clicked. The steel door slowly swung open. Standing in the harsh emergency lighting was Joe Young. He was dressed in a tailored black suit over a dark shirt, an assault rifle held casually at his side. He moved with a slight stiffness from his sutured wound, but his posture was towering, utterly commanding. Behind him, Tay and a squad of tactical operators in unmarked gear cleared the remaining corners of the clinic, stepping over fallen triad gunmen. Joe Young stepped into the doorway, his piercing dark eyes locking onto Zuri. The cold, ruthless mask on his face softened by a fraction as he lowered his weapon and extended a large calloused hand toward her. "You're alive," he murmured, his voice low and steady amidst the carnage. "I used animal sedatives on Park," Zuri whispered, taking his hand. His grip was warm, iron-strong, pulling her effortlessly to her feet. A rare, dangerous smile touched the edge of Joe Young's mouth. Resourceful, but your quiet life in this city is over, little doctor. You saved my life, and now mine belongs to protecting yours. Before she could process the words, Joe Young draped his heavy wool coat over her trembling shoulders, guiding her out of the blood-splattered clinic and into an armored convoy waiting to vanish into the fortified darkness of his estate. The armored convoy roared through the towering wrought iron gates of a secluded mountain estate, surrounded by reinforced concrete walls and high-caliber security checkpoints. Inside the sprawling war room of the compound, massive monitors displayed real-time surveillance feeds of the entire city, docks, transit lines, and the Triad's primary strongholds. Tay stood beside a long mahogany table, laying out blueprints and weapon inventories, while a dozen lieutenants awaited orders. Detective Hayes has locked down the precinct, and the remaining Red Dragon captains are regrouping at the Harbor District, Tay reported, his voice clipped. They know you hit back. They're calling in reinforcements from the coast. Joe Young sat at the head of the table, his unbuttoned shirt revealing fresh, blooming crimson soaking through the sterile white gauze over his abdomen. The physical exertion of the rescue had torn through Zuri's stitches, reopening the deep laceration. Zuri stepped forward, carrying a freshly stocked medical tray provided by the estate's private clinic. "You need to stop talking and sit still," she said, her voice cutting through the tense atmosphere of hardened killers. The room went dead silent. Lieutenants exchanged wary glances, unaccustomed to anyone issuing orders to the syndicate boss. Joe Young simply held up a gloved hand, dismissing his men. "Leave us." Tay bowed slightly and led the team out, sealing the heavy double doors behind them. Zuri knelt beside Joe Young's chair, pulling away the ruined bandages. The wound was angry and torn, fresh blood pooling over the intricate dragon tattoos carved across his torso. She picked up the curved suture needle and antiseptic, her hands steady despite the chaos that had just unfolded. "You tore through 6 internal stitches kicking that clinic door down," she murmured, cleaning the torn flesh with practiced, gentle care. "You shouldn't even be standing, let alone launching a citywide war." Joe Young didn't flinch as the needle pierced his skin. Instead, he reached out, his calloused fingertips lightly brushing a loose curl away from her cheek, tilting her face up to meet his dark, unyielding gaze. "You pulled me from the gutter when I was a dead man. They broke into your sanctuary. They threatened your life. I would burn every burrow in this city to the ground before I let anyone lay a finger on you." Zuri's breath caught in her throat. Looking into the unblinking intensity of his eyes, she realized the terrifying truth. This wasn't just a boss settling a gang feud. It was a man dismantling an empire purely to keep her safe. By the 4th sunrise, the smoke over the downtown district had finally cleared. The Red Dragon Triad was completely dismantled, their strongholds seized, and their corrupt allies in law enforcement purged. Joe Young's syndicate held undisputed control over the city, the underworld realigned beneath his absolute authority. Zuri stood on the expansive glass balcony of the estate's penthouse, watching the morning mist roll over the distant skyline. She wore a soft cashmere sweater over dark slacks, the smell of sterile vet hospital bleach finally replaced by the crisp mountain air. Heavy, measured footsteps approached behind her. Joe Young stepped onto the balcony, dressed in a pristine charcoal suit. The lethal tension that usually clung to his broad shoulders had settled into a quiet, calm strength. He placed an unsealed manila envelope on the marble railing beside her. "It's done," he said, his gravelly voice carrying a gentle cadence she had only ever heard when they were alone. "Hayes is in federal custody, and Park's faction is gone. You're completely safe now." Zuri opened the folder. Inside lay an authentic passport with a clean identity, title deeds to a quiet seaside clinic in southern Europe, and an open-ended first-class flight departing that evening. A new existence, untouched by violence, bullets, and shadows. A clean slate, Joe Young murmured, looking out over the city rather than at her, his jaw tightening slightly. No hitmen, no midnight ambulances. You get your life back, Zuri, exactly as it was before you opened your door to a bleeding monster. Zuri looked at the plane ticket in her hands, then turned to face the man who had brought a city to its knees just to keep her breathing. For years, she had survived by keeping her head down, fixing broken creatures in the dead of night, and staying invisible. But invisible wasn't living. Reaching into her pocket, she pulled out the heavy, engraved silver lighter he had left on her coffee table that first morning. With a sharp, deliberate flick of her thumb, the steel wheel sparked, and a clean blue flame danced in the morning breeze. Without breaking eye contact with Joe Young, she brought the corner of the first-class boarding pass directly to the fire. The thick paper caught instantly, curling into blackened ash that drifted over the balcony ledge into the abyss. Joe Young's dark eyes widened by a fraction, a sudden fierce heat flaring within them. "I don't run from the dark anymore," Zuri said, closing the lighter with a sharp, echoing snap. "And I don't abandon the things I choose to protect." A slow, possessive smile curved Joe Young's lips as he closed the distance between them, wrapping an iron arm around her waist and pulling her close against his chest. The city belonged to him, but as he leaned down, sealing their fate beneath the rising sun, they both knew who truly ruled the king. And just like that, an ordinary night shift turned an exhausted veterinary nurse into the undisputed queen of the city's most dangerous empire. If you loved Zuri and Joe Young's intense, high-stakes journey from a blood-stained welcome mat to the top of the underworld, make sure to hit that like button and smash subscribe with notifications turned on so you never miss our next post-pounding story. Drop a comment below and let us know what you would have done in Zuri's shoes. Would you have taken that plane ticket to safety or burned it to stand by the king? And don't forget to tell us what city or country you're tuning in from today. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you in the next dark, thrilling chapter.